Good morning and welcome back. We're about to start our first of two sessions this morning. We're going to have two sessions. There's going to be a coffee break as usual, and then at 12 o'clock there's going to be a brief half-hour conversation with Deanna Markham to help wrap up and make sense of what we've all been a part of for the last 2.5 days. But to start us off, we are now transitioning to the future, whatever that may look like or be, or however wrong we may think about the future. I was reminded of Jonathan Rose's opening talk about how in 2003 he tried to predict the future and how very wrong he was. But I think it is exciting to still talk about what the future may look like, even though it's still yet to be determined what it will actually look like. And to kick us off, we have Scott Ziegler moderating this panel. Scott is the head of digital programs and services at LSU Libraries. He spends most of his time developing strategies for the library's digitization and preservation operations, promoting the library's digital collections, which include the State Digital Library of Louisiana, and supervising the development and management of the library's online presence, digital exhibitions, and digital scholarships. And before joining LSU in 2017, Scott had spent almost a decade at the American Philosophical Society, where he really helped the APS develop its own digital strategies, which culminated with the creation of that center I talked about yesterday, the Center for Digital Scholarship. And so Scott's been engaged in these questions for years, and I really look forward to hearing him and hearing his thoughts on the papers that we hear this morning. So, Scott?
Good morning. Thank you, Pat. Oh, thank you. Good morning. It's so Sunday. So we made it to the future. I didn't know if we would, and everyone watching this as a recorded video in the decades and maybe centuries to come, this is what we think the future is going to look like. We are so cute. The future's also crowded. So as I do the introductions, I've asked that each one of our panelists raise their hands so we can keep them all straight. Before I start though, just real quick, I want to be sure that we thank the people who have kept this all going. So Jeremy, who has been helping us with all the slides, Todd, who's been up in the booth, Donna, who's been making sure that we all leave when the day is over and setting everything up in the morning. Excuse me, and everyone else that I'm forgetting, in addition to, of course, Pat and Adriana, who actually printed out paper for me. Because though I spend all my time doing digital things, I still like to look at paper. I feel like I should be paid by a paper company, but I'm not. So for our introductions, we have Emma Cawlfield, who started working on the Schoenburg Database over 7 years ago. It was her first job after graduating from college, and she's been working on the project ever since. She studied library and information studies at Florida State University's iSchool and currently serves as the project coordinator for the database, where she's responsible for data quality, user support, and instructional design. Next, we have Zach Lischer-Katz, who is a postdoctorate research fellow at the University of Oklahoma Libraries through the Council on Library and Information Resources Fellowship Program. In his fellowship, he is developing guidelines for curating research data associated with virtual reality technologies and 3D models, and is researching the impact of virtual reality and 3D tools on research and pedagogy in academic libraries. His personal research looks at the cultures and His personal research looks at the cultures and techniques of preserving visual forms of information, including film, video, and emergent technologies. He received his PhD in Communications, Information, and Library Studies from Rutgers University. Matt Cook. I'm looking over to see if people are raising their hands. I don't know if they are. You're in charge of making them do that. Is head of emerging technologies at the University of Oklahoma Libraries. In his role as an educational technologist, he has co-founded multiple university makerspaces and earned Campus Technology Innovator and Education Futurist Awards, and has been named a Library Journal Mover and Shaker. Matt has developed and deployed beacon-based indoor navigation applications, interactive mindfulness technology, and a custom-designed virtual reality workstation. His research primarily concerns spatial cognition, and he has presented on related topics in the US and abroad. Alex Wermer-Colan is a clear postdoctoral fellow at Temple University's Digital Scholarship Center. His archival research in academic scholarship explores the politics of decadent aesthetics in wide-ranging genres of 20th century literature, from colonial romance to science fiction. James Kopaczewski, thank you, I apologize for that, is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Temple University. A historian of the 19th century United States, his dissertation explores Native American understandings of the American Civil War era. He has held the Allen F. Davis Fellowship, as well as fellowships from Temple University's Digital Scholarship Center, and as well as the Center for Humanities at Temple University. He has published in an array of publications, such as Civil War Monitor, presented his research at institutions such as the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and won Villanova University's Graduate Research Prize in 2015. And now we'll start with Emma's presentation.
Good morning. So, in keeping with the theme of this conference, my paper broadly covered the past, present, and future of the Schoenberg Database of Manuscripts. This morning on our panel about tools and technologies, I'd like to focus on the database's collaborative initiatives, both with our users and with other related projects, because I think that's one of the most exciting opportunities technology affords us. The Schoenberg Database is a cornerstone program of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Larry Schoenberg, a Penn alumnus and manuscript collector, founded the project over 20 years ago. It started out as an Excel file, and over many, many iterations has grown into a powerful online finding aid, and metadata aggregator for the world's pre-modern manuscripts. In 2017, the database officially relaunched as an open access, community-driven tool, allowing our users to contribute their own knowledge as standardized searchable metadata. Not simply a repository, the database offers avenues for users to collaborate with each other within the app, to share their research, ask questions, and develop projects. We recently began publishing our dataset as linked open data in order to forge new partnerships with related projects around the globe. I'm going to give you a quick overview of these collaborative initiatives and hopefully demonstrate how the database is thriving by embracing our users as active partners in its creation and maintenance. Okay. So our need to gather contributions from our users stems from the mission and the data model of the project. The Schoenberg Database of Manuscripts is not actually a database of manuscripts, but rather a database of observations about those manuscripts. Our original mission was to aggregate descriptive and provenance data as it appeared in other sources, auction and sale catalogs, institutional and private collection catalogs, bookseller websites, or any other citable resource that describes a manuscript. The resulting data tracks the movement of manuscripts across time and place, as well as changes in manuscript scholarship over time. Because of the nature of our sources, the database can't make any claims for objectivity or truth. We have no way of knowing whether a source is accurately describing or cataloging a manuscript. And this is particularly true in the case of provenance. People are buying and selling manuscripts constantly at a rate so fast that published sources can be out of date by the time they're printed. And perhaps more importantly, it's not possible for us, with our small staff, to keep up with the sheer amount of data that's being produced nonstop now, both online and in printed sources about manuscripts. So, thanks to an incredibly generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from 2014 to 2017, we redeveloped the database into a community-built research tool. Because of the specialized nature of our data, our user community is also very specialized. They are scholars, librarians, booksellers, collectors, students. Our users often have firsthand knowledge of the manuscripts and the sources that we document in the database. They can corroborate information in catalogs, they can provide additional evidence when they think a source is wrong, and they can also tell us about new acquisitions at their institutions as they happen in real time. They possess information that needs to be captured and shared. We officially launched the new database last year, and as of this morning, we have 289 user accounts. So there's many different ways people have contributed. I'm going to limit myself to two this morning that I think are the most interesting. So this is a personal observation record, and this is a special type of record in the database that cites an individual as the source of its data rather than a catalog. The personal observation captures user knowledge in the same standardized format as our data from traditional sources. Here we see an example of a personal observation that provides updated provenance information. Database user Ed Vandervlist, who works at the National Library of the Netherlands, tells us that he just bought this manuscript for his institution. He gives us his new shelf mark there and also provenance information about the dealer he purchased it from. And because of this observation, we don't have to wait for the National Library of the Netherlands to update their catalog information. And we also don't have to wait for a human being to go to that catalog and then put that information in the database. Personal observations can be created as users visit museums and work in reading rooms, and they can also create them as they're browsing the database and want to comment on our data. We already have over 200 personal observations. We also have group workspaces where users can gather related entries to better analyze and edit data. Anyone with a user account can create a group, and they're designed to be a space where users can collaborate with each other on shared interests. The image you see here is of our Biblioteca Mexicana group, which began at the request of one of our new users, Dr. Frank Treschel, who's a linguist who studies Native American languages. He's interested in tracking the whereabouts of several Mexican manuscripts that initially appeared in an 1869 Puttick and Simpson sale catalog titled the Biblioteca Mexicana, which is where the group gets its name. We already had records for this sale in the database, but they were created many years ago using different content standards than we have today. So these records needed to be updated before they could be useful for Dr. Treschel's research. But as a new user, he wasn't comfortable updating all of this data on his own. And so this was the perfect opportunity for a crowdsourced project. We published a call for participants with 6 users signing up to contribute. And I know this page is packed with information, but we have here at the top, there's a description of the group's goals, so anyone that comes to this page can understand the task that needs to be done. We have a link to the PDF of the original catalog from which all the data derives. And on the right side, we have links to all of the entries that need to be updated in the database. We also have a discussion area at the bottom of the screen that got cut off for people to communicate with each other within the app. The group quickly finished their initial work, and they've since moved on to revising data from other catalogs in which these manuscripts later appeared. And many of the manuscripts have now been tracked into the 20th century. So I've been talking about how we're collaborating with our users, but we're also collaborating with other related projects. We're working on an international project at the moment called the Mapping Manuscripts Migrations Project, which is made possible via the Transatlantic Platforms Digging into Data Challenge with supporting funds from the IMLS. This is a collaborative venture among many partners: the Bodleian Library, the Oxford E-Research Center, the Institute of Research and of the History of Text, the RHT in Paris, the Semantic Computing Research Group in Helsinki, and the Schoenberg Institute. We're attempting to unite 4 related data sets of pre-modern manuscript provenance: the Bodleian Library Manuscripts Catalog, the Bibal and Medium databases, which store data on manuscripts in French collections, and the Schoenberg Database. Our goal is to create a single interface where researchers can explore this combined data set, asking and answering new questions about the movement of manuscripts across time and place. As a first step in participating in this project, we generated an RDF triple store of the Schomburg Database, which is now available on our website, and we also have a Sparkle endpoint for users to explore this new data set. By exposing our data in this way, we're laying the groundwork for additional collaborative projects in the future. And that's because collaboration is paramount to the database's continued relevance as an information resource. By empowering our users to become active participants in the database's development and maintenance, we've ensured that our data set grows and stays relevant to the needs of our users. By sharing our data and collaborating with other projects, we help to advance scholarship and generate a deeper understanding of the world's shared cultural heritage. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming this beautiful morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today. Today, we're going to be talking about expanding access to library collections in 3 dimensions. I know you thought you were working in 3 dimensions already, but we'll tell you where we're going. Now, the future of academic libraries, let's see, this goes forward. There we go. The future of academic libraries depends in large part on their ability to adapt to rapidly evolving scholarly and pedagogical practices amid constantly changing digital technologies, while at the same time staying true to our library values of inclusion and equitable access to all forms of information. Virtual reality technologies combine immersive and interactive interfaces with stereoscopic sound and visual media to produce the impression of being physically present in simulated environments. The other side of the VR technology is the content, the 3D data that are being captured from the world in the form of scans of archaeological objects, cultural heritage sites, as well as computer-generated 3D visualizations such as complex protein structures and weather simulations. Now, the current wave of 3D data being produced across academic and commercial fields offers a whole new class of information object that libraries will be expected to organize, preserve, and make accessible. Together with the adoption of VR technologies, which enable the immersive engagement with these 3D data forms, these trends are poised to transform the library of the future, shifting it further away from its flat, logocentric traditions. But where did these VR and 3D technologies come from? We might trace the birth of immersive visual technologies to early fireside storytelling, in which flames and oral traditions of storytelling present an immersive and multimedia experience. And we could trace these through the history of theater, set design, and various other forms of creating immersive experiences. And it's easy to note that humans have long desired to inhabit fantasy lands, virtual worlds, literature, for instance, as well, fashioned through the various arts and sciences available at any particular historical moment. More recently, we can observe 2 major intellectual trends that have helped to move these the quest for immersive visual technologies into the digital age. And I frame these as the quest for verisimilitude seen through the development of media technologies and the rationalization of physical space through geometric projections and measurement systems based on Cartesian projections and things like that. This discourse of verisimilitude can be seen around the range of inventions that have come out and were implemented in the 19th century. New uses of the camera obscura, the birth of photography, stereoscopes, the phonograph, and other sound and image making devices that were put to use in this era to capture realistic and many so-called automatically produced representations of reality. And these we can see today is helping to construct this ideal of virtual reality as facilitating total sensory engagement with a simulated construction of reality. Another important trend shaping the discourse on virtual reality is the rationalization of space. The development of 3-dimensional scanning and modeling technologies are impossible without the rationalization of physical space. A popular technique today for constructing high-resolution 3D models, known as photogrammetry, was developed in the mid-19th century. That on the left, your left, is a patent from the 1890s for a hot air balloon-based photogrammetry technique. And it's telling that these tools were used for surveying, map making, and military purposes and other bureaucratic tools of statecraft. Contemporary VR systems and 3D capture emerged from these historical trends through the birth of computer graphics in the 1960s, and current 3D modeling techniques reduce matter in the world to sets of points derived from photos and laser scanning to position matter in space and based in a Cartesian coordinate system. This is transformed into polygon-based meshes of 3D objects that are presented in virtual worlds. And so through this process, we need to, as we're starting to adopt these tools in our libraries, we need to think about how these technologies embed epistemologies and approaches and cultural assumptions from earlier times. How do they define the form and function of human perception in the context of knowledge production? And so we'll come back to this at the end, but for now I want us to think about how do we bring these new technologies into the library while staying true to the library values. And so I'm going to turn it over to Matt, my colleague here.
Thank you, Zach. I just want to say that it's humbling to be here in the best sense among so many accomplished and articulate scholars. It's amazing the amount of overlap between these slides and our paper and what we've heard thus far in the proceedings. I give credit to the committee that did the programming. It is astounding, the connections that I'm seeing and drawing. But let's take a step back to the distant past. The year was 2013. And we saw the release of the first widely accessible, affordable virtual reality headset in the form of the Oculus Rift Developer Kit 1. Now, prior to that, it was only the most well-resourced laboratories and the most prestigious institutions that had access to immersive visualization technology. And they were pretty generous. They helped and supported a range of disciplinary research applications, including applications in fields like engineering and architecture and archaeology. But those results, while compelling, were not applied readily across different fields, and they didn't quite trickle down to the humanities, for example, until the release of the affordable hardware. Now, at the same time, fortunately for us, those same computer science and electrical engineering departments were leaning heavily on the psychology literature and the neuroscience literature and the cognitive science literature to try to tease out and identify what it was about the virtual reality experience that could be reapplied across disciplines and that was sort of generally beneficial for scholarship. And what they found was both simple and profound. Stereoscopic vision, which Zach mentioned, has been around in sort of simulated formats for years and decades, is extremely powerful when you're analyzing a complex 3D object in a virtual environment. The ability to perceive components of that object as they exist in the difference between the foreground and background in physical space allows for more effective and efficient analyses. That is to say, if I'm trying to identify or compare or judge or locate or describe spatial characteristics of complex 3D objects, I can do it in a simulated virtual environment better if that environment has the real world depth of field. Now that's sort of well borne out in the literature, but there's also this sort of hidden component, a complementary feature, and that is that the perceiving subject is also part of the virtual scene. So I have a head and eyes and hands in virtual reality, and therefore I can maneuver through that valuable depth of field without learning a complex or complicated new software interface. That's extremely powerful. That means that non-experts and the public can move through complex data sets without any prior training. And it's even more exciting when you think about data sets that were previously never part of the real world viewing experience. So microscopic or cosmic phenomena can be viewed as if it was an object in the world in front of you and move through in naturalistic bodied activities. Where do libraries and librarians fit in? I do feel like I'm preaching to the choir here with this slide after what I've heard so far, but libraries and librarians were never only about providing access to information. Rather, I see our role as providing access to the tools, services, and expertise to create, analyze, distribute, and archive new knowledge and new information. And that sort of broader conception of librarianship, virtual reality fits quite nicely. Secondly, you'll see and you'll notice a trend in the construction of library commons. We like to think of ourselves, and this is our motto here, as the crossroads of the university at the University of Oklahoma. This is a place where, like at Bell Labs in New Jersey in the mid-20th century, collisions between subject specialists were facilitated. But collisions between specialists and between tools and specialists. I'm running low on time, so I'll just touch on the third point, which is the next natural step to integrate research activity into the library using virtual reality. In the case of our course integration, VR-supported course module for anthropology, we took a replica fossil skull and deployed it in virtual reality. That skull was accessible for seconds during one class period for those 75 students in that class when they would hand it around person to person. This is a natural opportunity for libraries where you can put that same object in a real-world type viewing environment at wide hours in the library. All right, I'm going to go quickly through this. This is where we're going with this technology. So believe it or not, I'm a harsh critic of virtual reality, despite my sort of engagement, or perhaps because of my engagement with the technology. Right now, we're living in the age of the shoulder pack, late 80s cell phone era of virtual reality. This is a technology in its infancy. If you look at the hiring practices of Google and Apple and Microsoft and Facebook, they're hiring cognitive scientists, vision scientists, rendering experts. Within the next 2 to 5 years, you're going to see a new device that looks like this, and it's affordable, and it's sleek, and it is fashionable even, and we'll be able to deploy complex 3D content in the visual field at will. And that's where libraries and librarians come in. Collections can be reimagined in these new spaces, in these new devices and technologies. Imagine artifacts, specimens, molecules, models deployed in a size and scope that sort of defies and improves upon the vast collections that we have in our physical stacks. And we leverage the benefits of browsing in the stacks while disregarding the baggage of taxonomy and classification schemas that have been discussed here. We maintain the body-centered search activity and the expansiveness of source material in a virtual environment, and we deploy it in a way where students and faculty and staff can move through that environment naturally and compare and judge and find source material and hopefully insight and discovery as well. Zach is going to finish us up.
Yeah, sorry, we're over time a little bit, but I just want to make a couple points. And the things are changing so rapidly, and we have these powerful new tools, but we also need to be cognizant of where they're coming from, the histories, the assumptions that they bring in about the nature of knowledge. For instance, VR tends to privilege linear temporalities and Western perspectival systems. And we certainly do not want to recreate the inequalities and exclusions and dominant worldviews and power dynamics that plague scientific epistemologies from earlier eras. And we certainly don't want to recreate the corporate boardroom in the virtual world, which tends to happen sometimes. And I just want to point to some areas where libraries more generally can move forward. First, there's a clear need for libraries to start managing and curating and preserving VR and 3D data. And academic libraries are poised to take the lead in developing these standards and best practices. In 2018 alone, we've had 3 major 3D and VR-related preservation research projects funded through the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Second, libraries should use these new tools to expand access to existing collections and provide new forms of access and new applications. And then finally, these technologies need to be integrated into existing library services in ways that support the ethos of librarianship, continually expanding the library's mission to provide access to all types of information resources in ways accessible for all communities of users. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Thank you to the conference organizers. Everyone said it's a real honor to be here. I think I do owe the audience thank you for coming out on a Saturday morning to think about the future at a time like this. I hope our presentation today will maybe help us think a little further into the future so that these times too will pass. This, as an example, is a visualization of 100,000 science fiction books run through a neural network. We'll be kind of coming back to this in tracing today how we went from this to those visualizations. I'm going to give Jim a chance to start. We're coming from the Temple University's libraries, the Digital Scholarship Center. We'll be overviewing the project we've been working on for about the last year.
Great, thanks a lot, Alex. Right, so good morning, everyone. Very grateful to be here to share these lively discussions with you. So last fall, us at the Digital Scholarship Center at Temple, in conjunction with Temple's special collections, we began digitizing a set of duplicate science fiction novels that were housed in something called the Pascal Science Fiction Collection, with the original intention to digitize mass market materials, mostly novels and magazines, for non-consumptive research and teaching. And what we came up with was our presentation today, the new wave of digital collections. So, as we conceptualized how we could curate these materials for a larger public, we took cues from some of the major science fiction collections from around the country. And some of them are Bowling Green University's Popular Culture Collection, the Toronto Public Library, the Judith Merrill Collection, which is open to the public and is massive, and also the University of California, Riverside, and the University of Kansas, which have spent a lot of money and expended a lot of resources studying science fiction as a form. So as we sort of went through the Pascal collection, we had these things in mind and saw how other institutions were sort of curating science fiction. So that brings us to the Pascal collection itself. It's actually a really sort of interesting collection. I just want to take a minute or two to explain it to you. So it began in 1972 with a donation of about 5,000 novels from a Temple alumnus. And in subsequent years, it was enlarged through various institutional giving and trading, including some materials that were acquired from the American Philosophical Society. So while the Pascal collection has been periodically enlarged through the years, the overall collecting imperatives of the special collections in general really sort of revolve around the Urban Archives, which is renowned and is a very large collection of the history of Philadelphia. And as you can see here, the web page for the Pascal collection doesn't currently have any digitized material, just basically a simple finding aid. So when we first began this project, the majority of the Pascal's collection was in an unmarked room in the basement of Pelley Library. It's not exactly the place of inspiration you would expect. But within this sort of unmarked room, we found some really amazing things. Some of them were sublime. Some of them were outrageous, such as the amorous umbrella. And sorry to the folks from Kansas, but the gods hate Kansas. And also some things that are hauntingly familiar. So all these novels, basically, that are in our corpus cover what is considered the new wave of science fiction. And it's really a period of time between the 1960s and 1980s where modernist writers were trying to transform the form and content of science fiction. And some of the really critical writers of this period were Samuel R. Delany and Joanna Russ. And they were some of the first multicultural and radically feminist writers in science fiction. So also within sort of the corpus that we also have a lot of cyberpunk works, dystopian novels of college campuses of the future. So basically these visions ultimately gave birth to new forms of science fiction. And one of those really important forms as a historian is alternate history. And alternate history basically, it offers us a really interesting window into how people conceived of the future and considered what might have been possible. And in this project, really, I think a lot of the ideas of alternate history we've been thinking about is what would an alternate history of the library would have looked like? Had the Library of Alexandria not burned, and had funding and resources been abundant throughout time. So a little bit more on alt history here. So the literary form of alt history really is kind of speculation in its purest form. We found novels such as Hitler Victorious, which is basically a play off of Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, as well as novels that really strike closer to home, such as A Rebel in Time with the subtitle of The South Will Rise. And going through these, we really found sort of a disturbing amount of novels that reconsider what would have happened if the Confederacy had been independent and successful. Also, we found a book called The Indians Won, which is, yeah, agreed, yes. So, The Indians Won is an amazing tale which tells a counterfactual story of had Crazy Horse survived. It basically says he would have, he survived assassination, he defeats the United States military, and then ensures native sovereignty by developing nuclear weapons. Another outrageous alternative fiction is The Texas-Israeli War, 1999. So on top of these outrageous premises, what we find in a lot of these books are really great maps. And this is one avenue that we want to get into in the future, is taking these maps and sort of making alternative geographies and sort of seeing how these authors conceptualized time and space. Okay. So in the vein of these sort of speculative conventions in the new wave, we have started digitizing pulp science fiction novels, or what Theodore Sturgeon has basically said, 90% of crud. That's what we're digitizing. So basically, we have employed, I think, an admittedly sort of radical approach to collection development and curation. Instead of preserving rare objects, we have been destroying physical objects, breaking their bindings for the purpose of making a very pure and clean digitized copy of pulp science fiction. So during this process of cataloging, cleaning, and experimenting with the text that we've created, we worked together to scope out how we could implement both a long-term and flexible research project, as well as sort of question the landscape of digital collections more generally. And in this process, it basically has allowed us to experiment in a lot of different ways, and especially with what we have sort of defined as the new wave of digital collections. That is a collection that is heterogeneous in form and content, multi-institutional, and multimodal. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alex.
Thanks, everybody. We're getting a little short on time. I think we could spend a long time just showing you those books, so I'll try to go fast. The elephant in the room here is HathiTrust. Can't really talk about anything until we start talking about HathiTrust. If you're all familiar with it, named after the Hindi word for elephant. Also, interestingly, a character in Kipling's The Jungle Books, Colonel Hathi. So I think that raises, in its own way, something I can come back to. But I also think of the Buddhist ancient myth about the elephant, that you can, all these different people start trying to find out what the elephant is, and they're only looking at one part of it, and they start fighting. I think that's something we should keep in mind when we think about how to curate data as well. The real reason this is a big deal is Hathi just announced that they would be sharing their copyright information. That they will be allowing that to also be curated. This is about 17 million volumes, right? And so we're actually now in conversation with Hathi of giving them our materials, but we also are trying to think of different ways that we can work with and beside them. This is one of the most, probably a lot of you are familiar with, one of the most exciting tools they've been developing with a scholar named Ben Schmidt called Bookworm. It's an embeddable tool. You can curate your own bookworms. It allows you to both analyze, in this case, you can see a rise and then a deep fall in the use of the word pulp. And then I also looked up something like the word speculate or extrapolate. This is on a larger swath of books. These also raise this, they might strike you like prediction models. We've become very used in our society to prediction models now. There's actually just an announcement that amidst all the news, the Trump administration said they predict in 100 years that there will be 7 degrees of warmth to the globe, which maybe doesn't make sense to hear me say that, but it speaks to the way I think we're starting to use prediction models to make things inevitable, that we can't speculate on alternative possibilities for the future. One of the things that's really exciting about Bookworm is the way that you have metadata faceting. The primary preoccupation we had for this whole project was, how do we curate copyrighted data? How do we get you data that you're not allowed to see? And the truth of it is it's metadata, but it's also really interesting embeddable tools so that you can interact with that metadata. So how many of you have actually used data capsules on HathiTrust? Okay. I encourage you to try. It is not easy at all. And so one of the main goals we have with this project is, how can we think about user-friendly tools to access this data? also a very important model from collections data, I think that the Schoenberg manuscript project is very concerned about is how do we curate this for specific groups of people who will be interested in this material. As an alternative example, Temple recently was visited by Gale. They are building a new scholars lab. You can pay $10,000 a year on top of what you're already paying to have their tools so that you can analyze their data. There are a lot of problems with how they're curating that data. In terms of Hathi Trust, there's been criticism of the ways they're dealing with non-English language, for instance. So this is, I'm nervous about this development. We might end up having 5 different corporations, each owning data, and you can't do analyses across all of the data. So as an alternative, there's some really great projects going on. This is out of Indiana University, and this is in terms of social media. They've created, it's called OSOME. They've created all these great tools that you can go in and interact with Twitter data. Our favorite, which may be the inspiration of this project, is called Robots Reading Vogue, created by Yale DH Lab and Peter Leonard. This is an example of what it looks like, and this is actually a couple years old. So there have been a lot of new developments in embeddable, user-friendly tools since that time. And then finally, a rogue archive that very few people have heard of. Anyone here heard of this website? It took me a really long time to find it, and I'm a little nervous about even telling you all about it. It's called luminous.org. If you look it up just as Luminous, you won't find it. They have a whole manifesto, quite religious, and they have an amazing amount of material, many of which is copyrighted. And so they have a policy that says they'll take it down. I don't think that a library would be comfortable doing this. And it includes, for instance, issues of New Worlds that we didn't think we'd ever get unless we got a library to digitize them for us. They're doing this on their own. So our plan is to take those materials, web scrape them, and then try to trace from the beginning of science fiction, or at least this wave of science fiction, a larger genre map of the field. This is by Ward Shelley. It's a famous artwork tracing science fiction. So finally, I just want to show you a couple examples of the types of tools we've been using. Most of them, I think, kind of, if VR is one of the main, new innovations in technology, the other one is AI. This is using a neural network to parse out differences in images for book covers. This is what it looks like from a distance. And you can do the same thing that you do with images, you can do them with words. So this is what we call word embeddings. If you look up online, you can find this site. It's the embedding projector. I can take a set of texts, create a word embedding. I can give you that word embedding without violating any copyright laws, and then you can create your own projection, right? And so it's just one example of what you can do with this data. I just tried to slice into it, looking for words relating to library, information, data, and created a few visualizations that I think really capture how the new wave of science fiction, this is using our corpus, was thinking about these problems 30 to 40 years ago. So this is my favorite thing to do is this cluster dendrogram, which creates the relationships between words and a set of text and traces their hierarchies. I think this is the best way to look at it. And so you can see the way that different elements, libraries and books are being shelved off to one side, and data and circuits and neurons are being spread out in another area. And then you can look at how different sections connect and relate. And these are the kinds of things that, while you can't read these books and we can't curate them we can curate the data itself so you can interact with it and use increasingly available embeddable tools to modify it as you like according to your metadata, right? So this is going to be an ongoing project. It's we're speculating on where these things will go and waiting to see what tools become available as more open source tools are developed. And so it's still very much up in the air what will be the future of new wave of digital collections. Thank you.
I have so many questions. And not just about the amorous umbrella, which I suspect will be most of our discussion. But I am actually very excited to be part of this panel, to have the chance to comment on this. This is, of course, amazing projects and amazing papers. And taken together, they give us an excellent jumping off point for thinking about the future of libraries. And I won't be commenting specifically on the technical aspects of any of these projects we've heard about. So everyone up here is very smart. They're all working with wonderful teams at their home institutions. And technology, one of the best things, in my opinion, about technology and technical tools is they either work or they don't work, right? So there's not a whole lot to argue about there. Instead, I think it's much more productive to focus on the place of the new technology and tools given the past and presence of libraries. And any discussion of the future rightfully should be grounded in the past. And though we're now here in the future section of this conference, almost all the papers and panels so far have touched on the future while describing elements of the past and present. And while we can think about the past at large, I think we should also think about the past 2 days of the conference and what we've learned. So originally, and my notes are scattered. In fact, I see that I forgot some on the table. And I apologize about that, but in my defense, I didn't know what the future would be until I got here. And originally, it was my intention not to only tease out themes from these 3 papers that they share, but also to tie these themes together with everything that's happened in the conference. And I was going to quote other papers and discussions and highlight how they touch on many of the concerns that I intend to discuss here. And I'm happy to say that I now know that's impossible. As we heard before, the overlaps are just too many. The conference has been tightly interrelated. And so I'll do my best to reference a few other papers. Please know that I wasn't able to do it for everybody. But I'm going to do it for a very specific reason. I think while we talk about the future, we should have a very firm bedrock on the past, especially the past 2 days as we think about the libraries. And I also want to use that as an opportunity to funnel the discussions that we've had about the ethics of our practices. What yesterday I think was called the activist spirit that's permeated this conference. I would like to funnel that and talk about that in terms of digital tools and projects. I think very often, those of us who work in digital tools, we work very quickly. And we're happy to talk about ethics at coffee time, but then we have to get back to work. And I want any discussion of tools to always be talking about who we might accidentally be harming. So thanks to Alex and James and their discussion of speculative fictions, I think we're now in a great place to think about the future and the role of speculation. And within the framework of speculation, we can discuss both the genealogy of tools and technologies and library practices, specifically descriptive practices as tailored to specific ends and end users. So first, let's think about the speculative nature of libraries. Libraries speculate about future users, what those users might want and what they will need. We even speculate about who the users will be. And we also see this with donors. So Emma's history of the Schoenburg Database of Manuscripts shows the passion of a dedicated expert who speculated on the future use of the catalog descriptions he and his wife were recording. And from Alex and James's paper, we know that there was also a speculation about the future desirability that prompted Temple University to accept science fiction books from the APS. So all of this is a leap of faith, I think, a bet on the future, a speculation about future researchers that prompts libraries to collect material. And like all good speculation, these aren't blind guesses. These decisions are based on the past, what's worked in the past, and an understanding of the evolution of tools and technologies. So as Zach and Matt point out in their discussion, tools can promote specific ways of thinking. The examples they use in their paper is of the early Kodak film privileging white skin. Developing a critical discourse, they write, around technologies at the time of their adoption is particularly imperative for librarians so that we avoid importing the epistemological assumptions and cultural blind spots of the technologists who designed them. And I think this merges nicely with Mike Kelly's reference in his paper to Dr. Noble's book, in which she collects examples of how it matters who is developing the tools that affect us all. And this also merges nicely with the example that we saw of Dorothy Porter, who used the library tools of the time, catalogs, card numbers, and cross-references, even though these were not created to help her describe the collection she was trying to describe. The tools and technologies are not objective. They were built for specific purposes by specific people for specific ends. So both Matt and Zach's paper and Alex and James's paper discuss blind spots. So blind spots in our data sets and blind spots in our understanding of the social and cultural ramifications of our choices. And I'm also very thankful to Emma for succinctly making the point that descriptions show the motivations of the describer. In her paper, she writes, as people study and catalog manuscripts over time, the understanding of what the manuscript is changes. A monastic inventory from the 15th century will contain far less descriptive information than an auction catalog in the 21st century. And I'm reminded of the paper that we heard about the Harvard map collection and how these maps during their sea voyage were described in a manner that fit the other things on the boat. So these were all just put in a ledger when they were aboard and on their way to the United States. And we know that libraries make assumptions about who our catalogs are for. When it comes to speculation, libraries make about their future users, we know we have not done particularly well. When the guesses and assumptions are all made by people of one group, we know this doesn't go well for other groups. And again, I want to draw attention to the overlap with the works that Dorothy Porter had to do to get around the blind spots of the Dewey System, and with Mike Kelly's project to decolonize special collections, and Dorothy Berry's exploration of what it means to get to authentic accessibility. And we also saw from Katie Matthews' paper that libraries change with curriculum as land-grant universities move toward research agendas and were open to more people. From Alison Fraser, we learned about the ultimate speculation of future users when people went so far as to collect trash. And Jay Rossman reminds us in her paper that we do not move in a natural progression to openness. Instead, there's a complicated history there. There's a history of people pushing further than they've been asked to push. So it matters who our users are. It matters who we think our users might one day be. And it matters who we identify as users worthy of our attention and our labor. So what assumptions are we making now about who our users are and what they will need to do? So we heard about these themes also in the keynote panel and in many other sessions, and I wish I could catalog a full list of overlaps. I wish I could build graphs of linked data and triples, but I only have 2 minutes left. I'm interested to know now what we have, now that we have all of these examples in mind, now that we have almost the entirety of this conference behind us, and the promise of yet another session before us. What it means to us when we think about the future of libraries. So additional access and reusability via linked open data, for example, holds the possibility of inadvertently spreading problematic historic frameworks. When we use new tools to create access to our collections, and when we start to collect new things and new ways of interacting with things, what steps are we taking to ensure we're not propagating our problematic past? So I know that it would be unfair, completely and horribly unfair, for me to ask the panel to talk about all the blind spots that none of us can see, though I wish I could do that. However, I do know that all of you have been thinking a lot about digital projects. And I wonder if you'd be willing to speculate on what ethical considerations should be considered when we build tools to promote our collections. And so predictions of the future, as we all know, are artifacts of their time. And I'm asking this question because I know that it's true of me, and I suspect it's true of a lot of us who have worked in library description in general, but also digital projects specifically, that we have inadvertently been problematic. We have been part of the problem, and we took problematic descriptions and made them more accessible. So I'll repeat the discussion topic again, and then I'll sit down to listen. First, I'll ask this to the panel, and then I'm very interested, and I want to be sure that we have plenty of time for everybody else who I hope has ideas about this. So basically, we're wondering what ethical considerations should we have in mind when we are building these tools? And how can we apply these ethical conversations we've had when thinking about all the things we haven't thought yet? How are we going to build this into our day-to-day work? One of the things about building digital tools is that it's a wonderful day job, and it is a day job, and we get very busy doing it. So I'm curious about how, because I want to steal your ideas, to build this into one's day job, that we keep all of this in mind. And now I'll sit down. Anybody want to take a crack at that? With some hesitation.
Hello. Oh, good, it's working. First of all, I think, in terms of technology development, we really need more diversity of people actually doing the work, which would help a lot. Second, I think we need to be doing research at the same time that we're putting out new digital tools and technologies, and that's one of the things we've been trying to do with the virtual reality. From the beginning, when I was brought in, I'm like, well, we need to be studying what's actually happening in these spaces and collecting data, both survey data as well as interviews and think aloud sessions, and then we can help start to find some of these blind spots that we didn't think about from the beginning. And it becomes an iterative process. And the other thing is always keeping that historical aspect in mind. We are thinking about, okay, I went to an English class to present on VR. I'm like, well, this is not a new thing. And so I kind of try to contextualize it for them within histories of storytelling and visual representation and things like that. So those 3 or 4 approaches, I think, are maybe some ways we can kind of not forget the past and not make the same mistakes as the future.
Yeah, I mean, the only couple of things I would add are, when we were working on this project, it's almost entirely contingent labor. There's been a resident librarian working with us, and we have benefited from the rest of the library and all of the employees there, and we're grateful to all of them. But most of us have been fluctuating in and out of this project, and so there's a kind of problem with labor, I think, as well. I think where your data is coming from, how you are making sure it doesn't have blind spots. One of the motivations for this project is that copyrighted literature is where the vast majority of multicultural literature is written, and you can't access it. You can't read it. You can maybe look at it as data. And then on the other end, I think, is how do we curate the data so that it's accessible and user-friendly and inclusive. And I don't want to use the word accessible as if it's just a throw-out word for all types of easy-to-use things. I think we both need to be thinking about how it will be available for people who aren't used to using normal interfaces, but also the way that these types of interfaces can allow people to learn in new ways. I think that's the main point. Other than that, just designing with a target audience in mind, and that's partly what that collections as data motto said. I think what I would love to see as the new wave of digital collections is ways to curate climate change data to people who don't believe in climate change. I see that as the biggest task for libraries today.
I'll just add that I think having a conversation with your users is super important, and that can't just happen once. Like when you're building the technology, it needs to continue. We're really hoping with our new collaborative initiatives at the database that we'll be able to attract people that can contribute data that we have blind spots for right now. So for most of the database's history, it's been worked on by Americans and people working with English language catalogs. So we're really excited to get more data from other parts of the world. But yeah, I think we just need to always be having a conversation with the people that are using our technology and listen to them, not just let them talk.
I would add also the people we don't think, or we're assuming don't want to use the technology and outreach, promote outreach in many ways. I know, and maybe Matt can talk about this, working with local public schools, K through 12 education, or public libraries, and then kind of expanding what you think may be a very niche or very elite kind of technology to school kids and things like that.
We had a program yesterday. Local middle school students came to the library. This is the OU library back home, and they actually came first to the art museum, and they studied Native American artifacts, and then they viewed in VR 3D scans of live marine animals, sea turtles, in virtual reality, and then they went to the Natural History Museum and looked at live reptiles. So they saw this sort of pipeline for 3D content creation in the context of the art museum. That was an exciting application. Regarding the ethics of virtual data, I think it's notable that even in the midst of the recent Facebook data breach, nothing was said about the subsidiary company Oculus and the extent to which you are feeding back every time you use the headset your location in physical space. Imagine the intimacy of that data and the value to advertisers. They can tell where your head is And that didn't come out, in the media, or maybe that data wasn't compromised, I'm not sure. But that is the sort of intimate data that will continue to be, threatened in the future.
I think we should do some questions.
I'm at the ready. I'm Sarah Werner, and I have a question that builds on the sort of response that Scott was asking about the ethics. One of the things that struck me when Scott pointed out how crowded the future is compared to our panels about the past, is that the future as it's being represented at this conference is also overwhelmingly male. And very much in distinction to all of the panels that have preceded this, which have had maybe one man out of 4 or 5 speakers, maybe half, a couple of them. These are bigger panels, but they're also majority male. And I'm wondering, it's a little bit unfair. I mean, y'all are doing great work. You didn't choose to organize yourselves into this panel like this, but as a group to sort of think about what does it mean, especially in terms of labor. This is a growing sector of libraries. What does it mean that it seems to be pulling people in from areas that have already, all the computer sciences worlds, which are heavily male with programmers, and how do we counter that, I guess, or how do we respond to that?
I'll take a quick shot. With our project, I should just say it's a larger group, and part of what makes the future crowded is it's collaborative. And so there are a lot of other people I could name who are not white males on the project, but we are the ones representing it and the ones who maybe have worked the hardest on it and the longest. And I think what you're speaking to is a much bigger problem about digital scholarship and computational methods in the humanities. And it's a problem that's not going to be fixed by, for instance, us just trying to bring more people into the Digital Scholarship Center. It's about us going out to different parts of not just the college, but also high schools, and bringing these tools to people to get them excited about it. When I was growing up, my dad, showed me computers. I'm sure that partly led me to this place, right? And so improving that across the board, I think, is key. And I think what can be exciting about these new technologies is where issues like literacy or technological disadvantages, or I think just the distraction of our technology now, when it gets in the way, some of these new technologies can do a lot, I think, to get people interested. I did want to mention VR, for instance. All the things I was showing, those 3D models, you can view that in VR as well. And I think one of the things that's very exciting about VR is the way that it, especially for younger generations of students, may serve as a way to make them feel immersed and not distracted by their other environments when they're learning. So I mean, trying to use these technologies to make it seem, I think there was a period about 10 years ago where coding was very intimidating, and it's getting less intimidating. And I think our project is very much focused on how do we create user-friendly tools that will enable people to feel like they can go do this too. In the end, I think it's about teaching people how to teach themselves and to feel empowered that they can troubleshoot and learn these things. But it's going to be a long, hard focus for everybody, I think.
Can I just add that I think it's important for more established career librarians and scholars to always remember to take people under their wing. Mentorship is really important, and I've been really lucky to have a wonderful mentor, which is why I'm here today. So I think if we can be mindful of that in our workplaces, and if we're concerned about bringing more people to the table, give them a hand to the table.
I think, oh no, I think the lack of diversity is a problem.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh.
Another question here, but if
Oh,
you
okay.
want to add to that, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, in our working environment, it's very clear that lack of racial and gender diversity is a huge problem. And in hiring, in Matt's division, we're always cognizant, another white male on the team. It's a problem, and we are in Oklahoma in many ways very white, but also very diverse at the same time. And then the university, I think, does a pretty good job of that. But yeah, when we come to the context of the library, I know some of our colleagues or people of color, they feel very, very marginalized just in their own workplace. So yeah, we're definitely cognizant of it, and it's a problem.
I just had to add, Neil Saphir from the John Carter Brown Library, to add to this question of models and diversity. I think it's also, I think there's a risk of paying too close attention to the dynamics here in the United States also, and not recognizing that there are, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people working in digital technologies, digital humanities, that are outside of this country, that completely destroy any of the fixed ideas about the hierarchies that we have in this country. I mean, if you think about Mexico, for instance, suddenly the question of who's indigenous and who's not indigenous, it gets kind of troubled because because of their history, almost everybody is indigenous in Mexico, and they're doing incredible digital humanities projects. And in fact, the DH conference this year was in Mexico City for the first time. There's lots of there are lots of women, lots of people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So I do think that obviously there are challenges to diversity in this country, but I think that when thinking about the amount of work that is being done elsewhere, it's important to connect to those projects, and that was the question that I wanted to pose to you, is to what extent do your projects contemplate other international communities that obviously, in terms of the manuscripts, they're European centers, but thinking about, more north-south connections. You have a place like India, for instance, that, obviously is a IT and technology powerhouse. Are there attempts that you see within your fields to reach out to those different worlds?
So the Schoenberg database, it's in English, but we do have the capacity to store data that's in other languages. That hasn't been a big focus because of, all of us that work on it don't speak anything that's not a Romance language, I think. But with the crowdsourcing capabilities, and now that the database is open to anyone, anyone can contribute. And we did have someone, I believe from India, who's added some data. But again, the struggle, there's a language barrier. How do we communicate with these other communities? That's something we should focus on in the future, definitely. But the technical capabilities are there. I think it's about having the human conversations now.
I guess I would just say I'm sure the tools that we're using have been made globally by people all over the world, and I would love to do a post-colonial sci-fi corpus, and there's a lot there. One problem is the language issue and OCRing in different languages, and designing a collection of global literature is going to be hard to curate to a specific audience. So I think there are going to be issues. I think we always envision this project as not one site, but a network of ideally libraries, not just in America, that have pulp materials or sci-fi materials, and ideally would not just be one website. There are a lot of sites out there already, especially from the 90s, that could grow, and there are lots of new sites that could be made. I think ideally lots of different libraries all over the world will be using these same embeddable tools to curate their data and learning from each other.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Mount Pleasant. I am the program director for the Native American Scholars Initiative here at the APS, and I also teach at the University at Buffalo. I really appreciated all of your the conversation today, and especially Scott's comment. My question builds on Neil Safer's question, and I'm thinking of course, of indigenous peoples, both in terms of speculative fiction, which is exploding currently, and then also the virtual worlds that are being created by programs like Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace by Jason Lewis and Scawanati. And so I guess I'm wondering what partnerships are you envisioning as you think about possibilities for expanding your networks and bringing in people who are already doing this work, who are already mentoring the next generation of writers and librarians and people invested in digital technologies and building virtual worlds?
Specifically, we are in the process of putting together an NSF grant for undergraduate STEM education, and we're partnered with Arizona on that grant, and they have a co-PI, a good friend of mine, Anthony Sanchez, who's the liaison for Native American Studies at that university, and he, as part of the broader impact portion of that grant application, is going to be working with local populations, local indigenous populations. Also, we do act, as we've heard, as fountains for local and regional indigenous culture. I'll just give you an example. Oklahoma has a large tribal population and artifact collections. We had a live virtual VR event, which was a photogrammetric scan of a cave system in Arizona with archaic native cave art inscribed on the walls. It's hidden, it's kept private for fear of vandalism, but that was made available in a virtual environment with an expert in the history of that time and that content for anyone in any university with the right hardware to participate in a real-time VR lecture and a walkthrough of that content. So it's like you're making it, this content more available to a wider audience, and you're putting them in the same virtual room as the expert that can contextualize that content. So in that way, giving a platform to rare or distant or fragile artifacts and experiences is very powerful.
And one thing we're still grappling with is the sort of thinking about if you're doing a very accurate 3D scan of a space or an artifact, what sorts of, we have this idea of, the Western libraries, everything, make it accessible, but some of these materials might need to follow certain cultural protocols of that community. And so how do we build that into the system when we're using them? And that's still a big question that we're sort of trying to address. Yeah.
I guess please join me in thanking our panelists.